Serious. What's the creepiest slash scariest thing you've ever experienced in your life? This is the story of how a creepy encounter with a scary man at a harbor cafe saved me from something even more terrifying. It was in the autumn of 1994, and I was 19 years old. At the time my dad had been working for almost 6 months abroad, and I was planning a surprise visit. My dad and I have always been close. I am an only child and my mother died in cancer when I was still a baby. So, it was just my dad and I, really, a tiny little family, but he made up for it by being the most awesome parent ever. Now that I wasn't a little kid anymore, I appreciated that more and more. I had booked the ticket and was ready to go. It was going to be great fun to surprise him with a visit. I had to take the ferry though, and I had just gotten my driving license and felt really unhappy about having to drive my little car on board the ferry, and decided to not bring a car at all, and just rent one once I got there. Having time to spend, I decided to have coffee at a nearby cafe since I was early, and they hadn't started letting people onto the ferry just yet. At the cafe there were lots of truck drivers and I soon realized I was the only woman there. One man, a 40-ish bloke with ice blue eyes and tattoos all over, was eyeing me from across the room, not even trying to be discreet about it. I got up to leave, feeling suddenly very uncomfortable, and to my utter horror he followed. What do I do now? I asked myself. This was before everyone owned a cell phone, I might add. I decided to try and look busy and maybe he would leave me alone. So, I pulled out my ticket and tried to look like I was reading it carefully, when he suddenly snatched it from my hand and said, "I'm on the same boat. I'll have hours of your company then." How lovely, he said in a voice that was an absurd combination of jovial flattery and hidden hostility. I felt it very strongly that if I got on that boat, with this man who now knew my booking details, I'd be in grave danger. I can't explain why the feeling was so overwhelming, but it was, and I decided there and then to not get on the boat. The ticket had been cheap anyway, I could get on the next one instead. I hid in the ladies' room until I knew the ferry had left, and then I went to rebook my ticket. The story could have ended here, a creepy encounter with a stalkerish man, but it doesn't. I was right in the assumption that getting on that ferry would have been unbelievably dangerous. Have you figured it out yet? The date was September 28, 1994. The name of the ship was MS Estonia, and that cold night she sank in the Baltic Sea, taking 852 people with her, resulting in the worst ferry catastrophe to strike Sweden to this day. I still recall that day with horror, and wonder what would have happened if this creepy man had not taken an interest in me. If I had not listened to my instinct and gotten on board instead of waiting for the next boat, would I have been among the survivors? Or would my dad have seen my name on the list of lives lost in the Baltic Sea? This was a long time ago, about 25 years ago. I had tree trimmers out at my house for the last 2 days. I lived alone at the time. I did have the presence of mind to set out some men's shoes on the porch, but after being there for 2 days, for someone who was paying attention, it was pretty obvious. I was a single woman. The night the crew finished up, I was upstairs in bed. It was late, around 1 a.m. My car was in the driveway, my bedroom light was on, so it was obvious someone was home. I was in bed reading when I heard a noise downstairs. It was a familiar noise, but I couldn't quite place it. I laid there listening and heard it again, followed by the sound of things falling onto the floor. It hit me then what the noise was. One of my window screens being pushed open, followed by books I had lined up along the windowsill falling. I was totally frozen in fear for a minute, just lying there with all my senses on high alert. Then I heard another thumping noise. What I assume was the sound of feet landing on the wooden floor. There was someone in my house. That's when I grabbed the bat I had next to the bed and went to grab the phone. This was before cell phones, back in the time of landlines and cordless phones. That's when I realized I had left the cordless downstairs. I locked my bedroom door and started screaming that I knew they were there, that I had a gun and I was on the phone with the police. I proceeded to pretend like I was on the phone with 911. I opened my bedroom window and removed the screen, getting it ready in case I had to jump out my window. I don't know if it was me opening my window or maybe my screaming, but something set off my neighbor's dogs. They started barking and moving around, which turned on the motion sensor lights in my neighbor's backyard. I went to stand at my door with my ear pressed against it, listening, continuing my fake 911 conversation. It was an old house with wood creaky stairs, so if they started up the stairs I would hear them. It was dead silent. Then I heard scuffing noise, the sound of the window downstairs rattling, followed by the sounds of someone running beneath my bedroom window. Something scared him off and he jumped back out the same window he came in. I went to my window and looked out, but I couldn't see anything. Whether it was me yelling that I was armed, pretending like the police were on their way, or the dogs barking, I'll never know. I had to get the cordless phone to call police. I knew where it was, sitting on the kitchen table. I stood there listening for a long time, terrified. I really thought I might have a heart attack. I was shaking, my heart was beating so fast, I had so much adrenaline running through my body. Finally, I unlocked my door, had my bat at the ready, and I crept down the stairs, into the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and then I took off and ran up the stairs 2 at a time, locked the door and called 911 and waited until they arrived. I walked with them while they inspected the house. The window in the study was standing open, the screen removed, books I had lined up along the windowsill were scattered on the ground. It was damp out and there were bits of dirt and leaves on the floor from someone's shoes. Outside the window was a step stool taken from my garage. I'll never forget seeing the bits of leaves and mud on my floor. It was proof someone had been in my house. He had been standing in my study. He knew I was home when he made entry. One of the first things the cops asked me was if I had any work done on my house recently. Tree trimmers. I'm sure it was one of them. They had been around for 2 days, long enough to get a general idea of the house layout and to ascertain I was a single female. I was so scared after that to stay in my house. I felt so incredibly lucky he got scared off, but what if he came back? I felt violated and I was angry. I spent the next few months either staying with my mom or having someone stay in my house with me. The only reason that window was unlocked was because the lock was broken. I had that fixed, and for extra insurance I put nails in so they would block the window from being opened. I would have installed a security system, but I simply couldn't afford it. The company was contacted, but there was no proof it was anyone from their crew, so there wasn't a whole lot to do aside from letting the owner know. Anyway, that was terrifying. To be a young woman alone in her house late at night and hearing someone climb through a window makes you feel so incredibly vulnerable. I'm very, very lucky. This person did not come to rob me, I'm sure of that. He knew I was home. He wanted me. If I hadn't still been awake, I wouldn't have hurt him, and things may have ended very differently.
I don't usually reply to this stuff, but I got one.
I'm about 16 at the time, just relaxing at home alone watching TV in the dark with my bulldog named Harley. So, we're laying together on the couch sharing snacks or whatever, and all of a sudden Harley gets up and slowly walks towards the hallway by the TV hunched over in attack mode. And I see his hair on his back stand up, and at the same time so does mine, and I'm covered in goosebumps and fear.
I slowly stood up too, and we both just looked into the hallway, which seemed darker than the rest of the house, and it just felt like something was there looking back.
A moment later it passed, Harley eases up and I run and turn every light on in the house. I still get chills thinking about it. I used to pet Harley and wonder if he still thinks about that night too. But he was such a happy fat dog it probably never bothered him. He died in 2010 at the age of 12. When I was maybe 6 or 7, I was staying the night at my grandparents' house. I was on the couch trying to sleep when I heard whispering. They had a painting of my aunt hanging on the wall in the living room, and it was talking to me. Nothing creepy though. It was talking the way my aunt would talk to me, asking me if I was behaving in typical aunt talk. She tells me to wake my grandfather up because she needs to talk to him.
I did, and when he realized she wasn't there he began scolding me.
In between threats and insults he noticed someone moving outside the window. He grabbed his pistol and told me to stay in the room with my grandmother. A minute or two later we hear a gunshot. Turns out there is a prison for young adults about 20 miles from where they live. 3 of them killed a guard and escaped. They were sizing the house up to take his truck and whatever they could, but he saw them first. Ended up shooting one of them in the shoulder. I have no idea why that picture was talking to me. They've never experienced ghosts before or since. Ghosts may have been a bad choice of words because my aunt is still alive to this day. To clear up any confusion, I have no idea why the picture was talking to me. I could have heard a noise that woke me up and, in my half-awake, child state of mind, imagined the picture talking to me. Or it could have been a guardian angel. I personally believe the first one. Either way, nothing like that has happened to me or anyone in my family before or after this incident. My childhood home was straight up haunted. My sister frequently complained about faces in the lights. My brother, maybe 5 at the time, came running in the house crying because the man hanging in the garage scared him. There was nobody there. I once woke up to a dark figure standing over my bed. I slept on the floor of my parents' room for days after that. There was an honest-to-God cave in the basement. Dirt walls went back maybe 15 feet. I never went in there, so I can't say what was in it. Electronic devices would sometimes turn on by themselves. Our dog would stare at one corner in one room and growl. Eventually we ended up buying our neighbor's house, right across the street. One night, after the neighbors had moved out but we hadn't yet moved in, my whole family was asleep. It was the middle of the night. Suddenly the fire alarms start going off. We all wake up and my dad checks the house. Everything is fine. He takes the batteries out of the alarms, and we all go back to bed. An hour or so later, we wake up to alarms again. This time it's the carbon monoxide detectors and the no battery fire alarms. My dad turns off the alarms, we grab blankets and sleeping bags, and we leave. That night we sleep in a big family huddle in the living room of our new house. My parents called someone to check the carbon monoxide at the house, and they report back that everything was normal. The next day we started moving and never slept in that house again. I've never experienced anything paranormal since then. I was in New York taking a training course and I was up late writing a paper. When I finished, it was about 3 a.m., so I decided to go downtown, find a Kinko's, print the paper, and then go to a diner and study before class. I was standing on the platform waiting when suddenly I saw a massive black man, around 6 feet 4 inches, in a yellow leather suit with matching fedora, and the whites of his eyes were blood red. He is standing about a meter away from me, just staring at me. He didn't make any noise, he just sort of showed up.
I got on the subway and so did he, sitting across from me, staring directly at me.
No blinking, no speaking, just staring until I got off. I had this dream that my brother killed someone and hid the body in our pool. It was in the winter and the tarp was on, so he was able to hide the body for some time. Eventually spring came and he was trying to get the body out to hide it, but it was so waterlogged that it was falling apart in his hands. The freaky thing is how real it felt and the amount of detail. It felt like I was living this in real life. I could remember news reports about the missing person, how I found out that he killed the man, my mom begging me not to report him to the police, the rotting flesh melting off the face of the dead person as he took it out of the pool, the police sirens, and it ended with me being so traumatized of what I saw I was placed in a mental health ward.
I woke up crying and it took hours for me to calm down and start my day.
It took a day or two to finally understand and process it was a dream. It took months for me not to be scared of my brother. My brother is super chill and the person in the dream was the complete opposite of him in real life. It's weird to explain, but I felt that I had to learn how to trust him again. It's been years since that dream, but it was so real and lucid. I've never had such a lucid dream since and I really hope I don't. I got into a fight with my boyfriend while over the phone, and because I was a stupid teenager, I decided to walk to his house in the middle of the night. Problem is that meant passing through a dimly lit, questionable part of town. But of course, no one cares, thought my 18-year-old self, as I trudged onward even though my face was streaked with tears.
I got a nosebleed too, because I was stressed, so blood dribbled down my sweater. But I was so edgy I just kept going.
Suddenly I came across a group of guys who had a ladder propped up against a wall. Right on the other side was one of those wealthy houses that were part of a subdivision. I froze. They hadn't noticed me, probably 4 or 5 of them, with one guy already climbing the ladder. But one of them turned his head and looked straight at me.
I remember my heart pounding, my mind screaming to run even though my feet wouldn't move.
I thought I was going to be killed. The guy let out a yelp. This got the attention of the others, and I heard a lot of panicked expletives. Turns out seeing a bloody girl in the middle of nowhere will deter any criminal. It didn't help that I have stereotypical Asian features, complete with a Heim cut with bangs that reach my eyes. In hindsight, to them, I looked like something out of a horror movie even though I was in my pajamas. The guy fell off the ladder and along with the rest, jumped into their car and drove off. For the first time I was thankful of my spontaneous nosebleeds. As a young child, I had an imaginary friend who would frequently step through the window next to where I sat and watch movies with me on an old TV/VCR.
I have rather clear memories of this part at least, and of 2 key features of my imaginary friend. The first being that I called him Sonny, and the second that Sonny was an extremely tall guy.
While I don't have specific memories of what Sonny looked like now, I do remember that Sonny had to bend down as he stepped through the window and into my playroom. To preface this next part, this is where my mother's side of the story comes in.
I have no true recollection of these events.
It is a situation where I feel like I have a memory of the event, but realistically I think this is where my mind is filling in the blanks of the memory with my mother's story. Her story goes that while going through a box of my father's stuff, my mother found a boatload of pictures of my dad's family and kept them out for him to look at after he returned from work.
I, being the nosy and bored child I was, spent my time with her while she was sorting things out and going through the pictures mostly quietly until we came across a certain picture of my grandfather, Dad's side.
This man had passed many years ago tragically in a car accident with a drunk driver and my father next to him. But that would be a story for a different time. Regardless, this is the man I identified as Sonny, who came through the window to watch movies with me. My mother told me no, this was my grandfather who was no longer with us. After all, his name was written on the back of the photo clear as day and could be interpreted in no way as Sonny. The day went on and my father eventually returned from work and my mom showed him all the pictures she had found, of which I believe at least one is still hanging around the house somewhere. As they went across the picture I had pointed out, my mom told him how earlier I said this was my imaginary friend Sonny. This, apparently, was rather shocking to my dad, as while his father's name was not Sonny, this was the nickname his co-workers had given him. A name that I had no way of really knowing, combined with a tall, slender physique and picture recognition seemed to seal the deal for them. My grandfather would come in through the window to watch tapes with me. While the memories I do have of these events are mostly limited to the area he visited me in, the name, and the tall man climbing through the window, I have no real recollection of a sense of time around those events and when they stopped/started, but I'm sure my mother remembers as it spooked the hell out of her. So yeah, apparently my dead grandpa and I were pals. Like you said though, not particularly scary for me, but my parents sure freaked the hell out when I knew a name and a face of someone who died years ago. I guess it wouldn't be scary for me, but it was for my parents. I talked to my dead uncle when I was around 5 or 6. They thought I had an imaginary friend. Turns out when that imaginary friend happened to be named Uncle Ben, the hairs on the back of my parents' neck stood up. He had died around a year before I was born. He was also incredibly close to my father. And then there was this one time I was driving down this road in Hawaii. I was on a rather forlorn stretch when suddenly, the temperature dropped from 80 degrees to around 50 degrees and the windows of my car fogged up greatly. I put on my hazards and started slowing to the side when suddenly it got to normal temperature again and the windows defogged itself almost immediately. And it wasn't a typical kind of cold either. It had this kind of chill that I would feel during a windy snowy day in the Sierras, the kind that pierces jackets. I could see my breath too, so I knew it was pretty cold. Yeah, that Hawaii incident gave me the spooks. When I was 10, I was home alone one night. My mom was divorced, and she was working nights at the time. This was in the late 90s in a quiet town in Sweden, so we didn't really have a habit of locking the door.
I was in bed, hadn't fallen asleep yet.
Suddenly, the front door opens, and someone walks in. It's too early for my mom to get home. I sit up and outside of my room, in the kitchen, I can just about make out the shape of a very tall, to me, man. He stops dead in his tracks before casually saying hello. I turn on my night light and the dude immediately start making small talk to avoid freaking me out, mentioning my mom by name and things like that, so at least I knew he was an acquaintance of hers. Still, something felt wrong. He was talking about my mom's old antique flintlock ornaments, saying she had promised to sell them to him, and he kept looking around my room, spotted my Nintendo 64 and asked if I was thinking about selling it. I wasn't. He told me he was only here because his mom had a bad stomach and needed to use the bathroom. I just nodded and said okay. He leaves the room and opens the front door, and I can hear someone enter, and she's speaking in a low voice so I can't really tell, but I think it was an older woman. He pops his head back into my room and tells me I can go back to sleep and that they'll be out in no time. I'm a little scared still, so I do as he says, and I turn off the light and lay back down. For almost half an hour I can hear him moving around in our apartment before there's a flush of the toilet, and shortly after I hear the front door close. I get up, make sure there's no one else in the apartment, then I lock the front door and go back to sleep. Next morning when I wake up, my mom is wondering about some missing things. The bastard stole our VCR, a couple of gold rings and my mom's silk pajamas. I remember back in the summer of 2002, I was at my mom's house. It was summer and the AC had gone out, so I decided to sleep downstairs. I'm tossing and turning BC, it's hot. So, I basically just lay on the couch and close my eyes and hope to go to sleep. All of a sudden, I get this urge to look over to the stairs, and I see these two beings just floating. At first, I was like okay, my eyes are playing tricks on me, but then the two beings began to move down the stairs. It looked like two little children. I was terrified. I pulled the cover over my head and was scared the hell out. The funny thing is when I told my mom about that, she had mentioned that she had also experienced strange happenings in that house. My stepdad said the same thing. It was terrifying, alright. I'm freaking out just talking about it, but here goes. I was 12, hanging out with the next door neighbor's kid EJ, also 12 years old. His parents went to a movie, so it's just us playing Sega upstairs. After a round of the game we were playing, he stands up and walks down the hall to his parents' bedroom. I'm chilling and I hear him all excited, "Dude, check this out." I walk down the hall. He's sitting on his parents' bed. The whole room is dark minus a lamp he had turned on. He's holding his dad's .38. He looks up at me, smiles the creepiest grin and says, "It was really nice knowing you," and puts a bullet through his mouth. I noped the hell out. I didn't eat for a week, I couldn't sleep. But I also was physically unable to talk. Literally, I was unable to open my mouth. And there was a voice screaming at me the whole time, "If you tell, you die." A week later, I woke up and was suddenly able to talk again, and I told my parents what happened. Of course, mortified, they called the family. They were in Spain, for the past month. And it was perfectly fine. I saw psychiatrists for years, and I still couldn't find a valid answer to that. One psych said it was probably a bad dream, yet I still have identical trauma to someone who's seen death at a young age. The one time I had sleep paralysis, I was in bed with my and his bed was against the wall at the time.
I was on the inside by the wall, he was on the outside.
I woke up and looked down to see a large colorful spider with big fangs slowly crawling towards my face. I remember trying to move away but I couldn't. I was just breathing heavy and fast as it got closer. Right before it touched my face, I snapped out of it and shoved myself against my trying to get away. He woke up in a panic asking what was wrong and I said, "There's a spider on the bed," but it was gone.
I didn't know if I dreamed it or if I was seeing things or what the hell happened.
So, I googled the spider I saw and there's nothing like it in existence, especially in the desert where I live. It looked like some kind of exotic shiny spider you'd find in a tropical forest.